our session number 7 on the Bible. And I'm going to see if I can get the... Okay, so once again, we see the PowerPoint? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. So here we go. There's a tremendous amount to cover. To cover the Bible in one session is pretty optimistic. Couple of points I want to emphasize. One is the Bible is a library. It is not a single book. Some of you that know, I know a little bit of Spanish. I know more Spanish than I did a year ago, thanks to my friends in Guatemala City that got me up on my practice. Thank you, Jose. The word for library in Spanish is biblioteca, right? So biblio is not simply a book, it is a library. And indeed, in the Hebrew Bible, as we'll see, there are 39 books in the Bible, and they don't all agree with each other. In fact, one of the really interesting things about Bible study is examining a book whose purpose seems to be to contradict, to oppose an earlier book in the Bible. And I'll probably mention this, I probably have mentioned this, the rabbis had arguments, we'll see it in just a few minutes. The rabbis had arguments about which books should be in the Bible, which books should not be in the Bible. It was written in Hebrew without vowels. The vowels were added in the 7th century of the Common Era. So then there's a few important translations. A very important translation is the Septuagint. And I'm sure I've mentioned this many times, and I will continue mentioning it many times. What was going on is during the period of Hellenization, Alexander the Great and his influence on the world, that many Jews were speaking Greek. And just like you want to have a Bible in English or Spanish, Jews reading the Bible wanted to have a Bible in Greek that they could read and understand. So about 200 years or so, 200 to 300 years before the Common Era, before the time of Jesus, the Jews translated the Bible into Greek. And now here is the myth. Now there are certain myths I will embrace and think of as possible. This one I don't believe at all. Here is the myth about the Septuagint. The myth about the Septuagint is 70 scholars, that's where we get the name Septuagint, 70 independent scholars of Hebrew and Greek were each given the Hebrew text and told to translate the text into Greek. And they came up with 70 identical translations, leading to the theological implication that you don't have to read the Hebrew at all. You can completely rely on the Greek because the Greek was divinely inspired. And I think, I'm going to get into it a little bit today. I think this influences the creation of Christianity for reasons I'll mention in a few minutes. Another very important translation is a translation to Aramaic. Around the time of Jesus, Jews were not speaking Hebrew as a common everyday language. They were speaking Aramaic. And so it was important to have an Aramaic translation. And in many traditional Bibles, if you get a Bible, kind of a Chabad version of a Bible, you will always have the Aramaic translation. Another very important translation, just because we live in the culture we live in, namely a culture heavily influenced by Christianity, was the first Christian translation. And that was a translation into Latin, which was a common language, and the Latin, concept of vulgar means common. So the translation of the Hebrew Bible and Christian scriptures into Latin was called the Vulgate, written in the 4th century of the Common Era. By the way, Christian scriptures are written in Greek also, and it's actually an obsolete form of Greek. It's called Koine Greek, that's not spoken, and there's some argument as to whether it ever was spoken or was strictly a literary Greek. And then much later, around the 1600s or so, we have the King James Version. And actually translating the Bible into English was forbidden in the Christian world. It was actually considered, as far as I understand it, a capital crime to translate the Bible into English. And with the Protestant Reformation and Revolution, one of the first things that they did was to have a translation into English. Okay, here is a formula. The Hebrew Bible is equal to the Protestant Old Testament. I'm going to have a slide on this, actually 3 slides, which are very confusing unless you want to go back and look at them in great detail. But the Catholic Bible has more books in it than the Catholic Old Testament, let me be very precise, has more books in it than a Protestant Old Testament. So the Catholic Old Testament, minus those books which are called the Apocrypha, I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, is equal to the Catholic Old Testament minus Apocrypha equals Protestant Old Testament equals Hebrew Bible. Okay, is that clear to everyone? So these are 3 slides. There's so much information, it's a little hard to present it all. A major difference between the Old Testament that you will have in your Gideon Bible in your hotel bedside or any Christian Bible and a Hebrew Bible is the order of the books. So I'll just go through the beginning of this. So here's the order of the books in the Hebrew Bible. The order of the first 5 books is the same in everyone's Bible, Jews and Christians. And then we have in the Tanakh, we have a list of prophets next. And then, but in the Catholic or Christian Old Testament, they're called historical books. So Ruth gets shoved in here. You can see in the Protestant Old Testament, the book of Ruth all of a sudden appears there. It's not in that place in the Protestant Old Testament. I'm sorry, in the Hebrew Bible. Oh boy, am I going to screw this up? And the reason is Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges. So it's not an unreasonable place to put the book of Ruth. And then in the Roman Catholic Old Testament, similar to the Greek Orthodox Old Testament, you have a bunch of extra books that I'll just tell you. I mean, I have 2 more slides on this, but I'll go back. Whoops. And I'll tell you the books of Maccabees, I think I mentioned this when we were talking about Hanukkah, are not in the Hebrew Bible at all. And they're not in the Protestant Old Testament at all. There are 2 books of Maccabees in the Roman Catholic Old Testament, and there are 4 books of Maccabees in the Greek Orthodox Old Testament. So what's going on here? Broadly speaking, the rabbis during the Talmudic era, around the year 90 of the Common Era, had to make a decision, or made a decision. One of the things that they were doing was what's going to be part of our canon. Canon means the officially sanctioned books that we consider to be holy. And there were some books that they left in. There were some books that they took out. The ones that were rattling around were Jewish books that had been translated into the Septuagint. These were Jewish translations. So the books of Maccabees were Jewish books that were translated into Greek, and the Christian church were very well aware of these, and they weren't necessarily so focused on the Hebrew, they were focused on the Greek, so they kept them in. And as you look through, here's more prophets, and then basically just different order. There's some books, they have different names, like Ecclesiasticus, I think is basically Ecclesiastes. It's in a different place. There are books that are not in the Hebrew Bible, Sirach, Baruch, and so on. And then here's the rest of the Hebrew Bible. So basically, the rabbis are making decisions, what's in and what's out. So I'll just comment on 2 of those decisions. One was the books of Maccabees, and the rabbis did not want the books of Maccabees in the Hebrew Bible. Why? They didn't want to encourage the idea of revolting against Rome. Think about what's in the books of Maccabees and the story of Hanukkah. It's the story of a successful revolt where the few Jews are outnumbered by the many non-Jews, but the Jews, with the help of God and with all kinds of miracles, overcome the odds and successfully revolt. The problem is that by the time the rabbis are making these decisions, there has been a horribly unsuccessful revolt against Rome, the Great Revolt, in the year 70, from 66 to 70. And the Jews are decimated in this revolt. So the last thing the rabbis wanted to do was to encourage another revolt. So they conveniently left that out. Another book that we discussed, because in the Talmud we have record of this discussion, is the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs is erotic love poetry. And we know it follows a format that Egyptian erotic love poetry follows. There is no mention of God. There's no mention of marriage. There's no mention of this couple being together for the sake of having children. It's eros and love and sensuality. And you might think this book shouldn't be in our Bible, but the rabbis understood it as an allegory between the love of God and Israel, which they thought of in very sensual terms. And of course, the church is going to understand it as an allegory between the love of the church for Jesus. I'm not quite sure where the church goes with it, but you can bet that a lot of people didn't think this, because the rabbis say anybody who thinks of this as kind of a bawdy drinking song, namely an erotic poem, loses their share in the world to come. So usually when there is a strong prohibition against something, it means a lot of people are doing it or thinking it. Okay, any questions on, let's see, it looks like there might be a chat. I don't always track the chat. So somebody is mentioning love of Christ for the church. Yeah, so the lover in the Song of Songs speaks about the lover's breasts, the lover's two breasts, and of course the Jewish allegorical understanding is these are the two tablets of the law, right? What else would you think of? Murray, you have your hand up.
Under whose authority did these people I don't know, cherry pick what is in and what is out?
Under their authority, and their authority, they would claim, this is a myth that I'm open to, they would claim that God gave Moses on Mount Sinai an oral tradition, and they used the oral tradition and the logic of the oral tradition to make these decisions. So they weren't just deciding off the top of their head. I have no doubt that if we went into the Talmud on each of these decisions, there would be a mathematical logic to making these decisions. But Murray, you raise a very good point, which I will come back to over and over again until people start sending me hate mail. And that point is that Judaism is the religion of the Talmud. That if we were practicing the religion of what Christians call the Old Testament, or we call the Bible, the Tanakh, the way we would relate to God would be by sacrificing animals at the temple in Jerusalem. Once the temple is gone, we had to fill in the blanks, but an obvious choice would have been to build another temple. But instead, the rabbis, understanding the oral law, changed Judaism, I would say, reformed Judaism from a religion based on animal sacrifice and a priesthood to a religion based on prayer, on study of sacred texts, and on doing mitzvot, which are good deeds. And this is part of it. They are taking control of Judaism. One of my teachers has a very interesting way of describing this. This is Yitz Greenberg, a liberal Orthodox rabbi. And he says, Judaism can be divided into three broad periods of time. From creation to temple times, basically God is in charge. God is making the decisions, God is speaking, God is commanding, and God's in charge. And the priests and Jews have a much lesser role. Starting with the destruction of the temple and the creation of the Talmud, the rabbis are in charge. And in fact, there's one section of Talmud, we'll talk about it next week when we talk about Talmud, where God shows up and says, no, you guys are doing it wrong. And the response of the rabbis is, who asked you? We're in charge. You don't even get a vote. Not only don't you get to decide, God, but you don't get a vote. And where do you see God's reaction to this chutzpah?
Could I make a follow-up question though?
Yeah, let me complete the
Oh,
final
okay.
the final era, which Rabbi Greenberg describes, and he is a Holocaust theologian. He argues that the Shoah, the Holocaust, creates a third period in Jewish history where the people are in charge. The rabbis have a say, but in fact, it's the people who decide really the direction that Judaism will go. Yes, Murray.
Um, I've been hearing like the rabbis,
Yes.
and I mean, uh, I'll just say I don't know much about Protestantism, but I know a bit more about Catholicism, and
Mm-hmm.
they have a whole hierarchy. You know, bishops and
Yes.
archbishops and popes, and
Yes.
is that also in?
So quite often when Jews talk about the rabbis, in Jewish tradition, they are called Chazal. Chachmenu zichronam lefrot. Our sages, may their memory be a blessing. We're really talking about the rabbis of the Talmudic era, not me and my buddies. Bryce.
Yeah, you just one tiny point. You've mentioned before that mitzvah is a commandment,
Yes.
but you just said maybe 5 minutes ago that mitzvahs are good deeds.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay. The Hebrew word mitzvah means commandment.
Yes.
In Yiddish and popular use, it's sometimes described as good deeds. I will slip on that, but thank you for correcting me. Okay, let me move ahead. One big issue is the issue of translation. So, from one of my mentors, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, writes, every text needs interpretation. Every interpretation needs wisdom. Every wisdom needs careful negotiation between the timeless and time. And I think what he's talking about there is the question of when we read something, we need to be thinking, and he's an Orthodox rabbi, so he would argue God said it. But the issue is, what did it mean to the people when the text was reduced to writing or when God spoke it? But clearly, there's also timeless meanings in these texts because God said it. And he argues, and I think it's brilliant, that fundamentalism reads text as if God were as simple as we are. That's unlikely to be true. And the Talmud, he quotes the Talmud as saying, one who translates a verse literally is a liar, because it assumes that there's only, it can make the assumption that this is the only meaning of the text. And once you translate, particularly Hebrew, which is a very broad language, we'll see this in a moment. If you insist that there are no other ways to read this text, that would make you a liar, according to the Talmud. So this is an example I keep coming back to. The first two words of the Bible are a grammatical problem. The opening phrase of the Bible is Bereshit bara Elohim, which is often translated as in the beginning God created. Sometimes you'll see a Jewish translation of in the beginning of God's creation. But if we wanted to say in the beginning God created, we wouldn't say Bereshit, we would say Berishonah. A Bereshit is half of an expression. In Hebrew, it's called a smichut. In English, it's called a construct form. According to the laws of Hebrew grammar, after the word Bereshit, you need a noun with the word of understood. So if I were to try and translate this literally, I would say, in the beginning of, God created the heavens and the earth. Because the third word of the Bible, the second word of the Bible is not a noun, it's a verb, bara, God created. So Rashi teaches, one real possibility, looking at the scroll behind Bryce, is that it was a scribal error. The rabbis would never say that. They would say the Torah that we have is absolutely flawless. Another possibility I jokingly propose is that God wasn't so good at Hebrew grammar and made a mistake pretty early in the text. But what the rabbis, and here Rashi is 11th century, but Murray, is studying the work of the rabbis, 1,000 years before him. And what they conclude is God was teaching us in the opening phrase of the Bible that you can't simply translate. You have to dig into the text and try and uncover what meanings are inherent in these issues. And, my comment is God puts this lesson in really early for those of us whose attention might wander and we might miss it. Here's an example of the profound impact of the translation to Greek can have. The word Torah is derived from a root, yara, which in archery means to shoot an arrow to hit a mark. And those of us who have went to high holiday services sat through many prayers about our sins, and one word for sin is chet, which means to miss the mark. This root, the Hebrew basically consists of 3-letter roots, which then are used to create nouns and verbs and participles and all kinds of things. This root is the same root as we have for teacher. So in Hebrew, the word Torah means instruction in a very broad sense. I am giving you my Torah, broadly speaking, in these 18 weeks on Judaism. Tonight, I'm giving you my Torah, my instruction on Bible. In Jewish tradition, if you say the word Torah without context, I don't know if we're talking about a scroll. I'm going to show you some pictures of scrolls, or the first 5 books of the Bible can be called a Torah, or all of Jewish sacred literature. Whoops, I got to click over here. When the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek by Jews, this is a Jewish translation, when they come to the Hebrew word Torah, they have to pick a Greek word. And the Greek word they pick is nomos. In Greek, the word nomos means law, as in a code of law sense. It's a very narrow definition and understanding of the word law. So the Jews reading the Torah in Greek had a sense that all the laws, because the word Torah is used a lot in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, all the laws were absolutely mandatory and absolutely binding. This led the early Christians to conclude that the law, or the Torah, was an impossible standard or even a curse, making other paths to God necessary. So just some quotes from the New Testament. These are all letters from Paul. The genius of Christianity is Paul, a Jew who was a early member of a rabbinic movement, a Pharisee, who has an inspiration, an epiphany, and a vision of Jesus after Jesus' death. And about 2/3 of the New Testament is written by Paul. And some of the most important material are in his letters. So in Galatians, he writes, those who rely on keeping of the law are under a curse. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, and we may conclude that a man is put right with God only through faith and not doing by what the law commands. But Judaism never adopted the sense that if you disobeyed one law, you were basically out of luck. I think in no small part that foundational teaching of Christianity, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about Christianity, comes from this issue of translation. So translation is very important. Okay, history of Torah. According to Jewish tradition, God dictated the Torah to Moses, not just the 10 Commandments, but the entire Torah while Moses was on Mount Sinai, roughly 3,200 years ago. Who wrote it down? But in mystical traditions, in the Kabbalah, there are teachings that the Torah is the blueprint for the universe. So the Torah pre-existed, on some mystical sense, the universe. Scholarly understanding called biblical criticism. So biblical criticism is a technical scholarly term for those who read carefully into the text and try and discern literary hints into what's going on, certainly without necessarily ascribing the text to God. So one of the things we talk a lot about in our Saturday morning Torah studies is scholars can identify at least 5 voices, and every time, a new scholar takes a look at this, they find different shades and more voices in the text. So an author called J refers to God as Yahweh. If you spell Yahweh in German, Ja, as some of you know who's maybe know German, is spelled with a J. So that text is called J. Um, where we read in our translations the word Lord, usually that's referring to Yud He Vav He, God's actual name. J, generally speaking, is a storyteller whose characters are very human. E, and J is also understood as coming from the two southern tribes of Israel. E is an author who refers to God as Elohim, translated as God, and probably came from the northern kingdoms. P is a priestly author who is really focused on the functioning of the priesthood and purity issues and ritual issues about constructing the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary in the desert, and constructing the temple in Jerusalem. So, you know, in the story of Abraham going to sacrifice his son, it's very terse, and we don't hear much description or discussion. Abraham walks with his son for 3 days, and Abraham knows he's going to kill his son, and we would love to know what he was thinking or talking about. In P, we will have pages and pages of what the drapes look like in the Mishkan, and how you sacrifice an animal, and what you do with the blood, and what you do. This parts of the animal you turn into smoke, and this parts of animal gets eaten by those guys. And so the P author is really focused on that. A lot of genealogies. P refers to God both as Elohim and El Shaddai. H is a subset within P, who wrote the Holiness Code. In the middle of the book of Leviticus, the book of Leviticus is focused almost entirely on animal sacrifice. And in the middle of the book of Leviticus, we have this wonderful section called the Holiness Code, about what makes someone or something holy. And scholars believe that's probably a separate author. And the Deuteronomy has a very different voice than any of the other books of the Torah. So we talk about D. And in fact, scholars talk about the Deuteronomic historian that is prominent in even some of the books of the prophets. The Torah Scroll, a scroll that you find in the synagogue, is written on the skin of a kosher animal using the quill of a kosher animal, a bird, feather, and special ink. The parchments are sewn together with the dried sinews of a kosher animal. It takes a scribe about a year to write a Torah scroll, and many scribes will immerse themselves in a ritual bath for purity every day and recite special blessings before they recite the name of God. And there's a tradition, particularly among the Sephardim, there's a tradition of kissing the Torah as it makes circuits through the synagogue. I would say in the Ashkenazi world, you touch your talit to the Torah and bring it to your lips, or a prayer book and bring to your lips. The Sephardim, who are a little more passionate, will actually kiss the mantle. I have some pictures. So this is what a scroll looks like. And this is what it looks like up close. If you go to a bar or bat mitzvah, the child is reading from the scroll, and there are no vowels, so it's actually kind of hard to read if you don't understand the language. But if you do understand the language, I discovered, much to my joy, that it's not so terribly difficult to read. This is, I decided to put this in. The holiday of Simchat Torah, which I think is this Sunday, is celebrating with the Torah. And typically communities get together and they dance with the Torah Scrolls. I mean, there's a lot of traditions that go with this holiday. But one thing we see quite often now are people, are synagogues unrolling their Torah Scrolls. So this was a community celebration from the Jewish Federation of Ventura County. So we had Torah Scrolls from the different synagogues, and the congregation in Ojai, where I was the rabbi for about 5 years, brought this scroll. This scroll is over 300 years old, and it's you can see the color is different than what you usually see in a Torah scroll. One of the things I discovered as I was reading it, I found I had trouble reading it. And I realized there were barely any spaces between words, which is a very old tradition to conserve valuable parchment or vellum. Um, and I once did something that that I am pretty sure has never been done. Well, I'll guess it's never been done in the history of Judaism with a congregation. My congregation in Ojai, and we actually did this with the entire congregation in of all the congregations in Ventura County. I brought this scroll and I took off the cover and passed it throughout the community without any cover on it. So people were holding not the part of the scroll where it was written, but the outer surface of the scroll, because it's a different kind of animal, felt like velvet. And I suggested as people held this scroll to realize that it was written, when it was written, I think it's from Iran, Middle East, I think Yemen, I think it's a Yemeni Torah. When this was written, the United States didn't exist. And it's still eminently readable and clear. It's just amazing. Okay, I'm going to take you on a very quick tour of the Bible. Here's the general plan. I'm going to take you on a quick tour of the Bible. I'm going to point out some really interesting stories, and maybe read one or two sections which are most interesting to me. And I realize maybe I shouldn't do this, but for me, the interesting stories are the ones that are problematic. They're not the ones you learn about in Sunday school when you were a kid. They're the ones that help you realize this really is the subject of adult study. So in the Torah, first 5 books, by the way, the Hebrew name of the books are the first significant word of the book. So here is this book again. It's Exodus because it's going to tell the story of the leaving from Egypt, but the Hebrew name of the book is Shemot, which means names, because the opening phrase of the book of Exodus is, these are the names. So the word names is the first significant word. These titles, Genesis, Exodus, and so on, I think came out of the Greek, maybe Latin, but I think they're Greek. So Genesis is the story of the beginnings, creation, the flood, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, up to the point where Joseph is in Egypt. In the book of Exodus, a new Pharaoh arises that doesn't remember how good the Jews were and how helpful Joseph was, and the Jews are enslaved, and Moses is empowered to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, and there are plagues, and there's Exodus, and there's Sinai, and the purpose of Sinai is to get lots and lots and lots of laws, and there are also some interesting stories. The book of Leviticus, referring to the Levites were the servants and the priests. So there's a tremendous amount of ritual laws, sacrifice, dietary laws. And as I mentioned, in the middle of the book of Leviticus, we have this holiness code, which begins with saying, Kiddushim Tihiyu ki kadosh ani. You shall be holy because I, your God, am holy. So it talks about love your neighbor as yourself is in this section. Not withholding wages of someone you pay is holy. There's ritual laws in there, and not putting a stumbling block in front of the blind, not misleading people, not cursing a deaf person, which raises interesting stories. Why should you care about cursing a deaf person? The deaf person can't hear you, which really says you're not supposed to speak ill of people even when they can't hear you, because the word gets around. So that's the holiness code. The book of Numbers is wandering and whining for 38 years. Basically, the Jews are at that promised land in 2 years because they lack faith in God and themselves. They're not allowed to enter. And so God says, basically, that generation will die out in the desert, and only their children will enter the promised land. The book of Deuteronomy is Moses giving a sermon at the edge of the promised land at the end of the 40 years. This is now a new generation, the children of the generation of the Exodus, so they need to hear the story all over again. So many things are repeated. 10 Commandments are repeated, and the scholars and the rabbis have a field day discussing even minor changes in the way, let's say, the Ten Commandments are presented in Exodus and the way they're repeated in Deuteronomy. Now, we're going to leave the Torah. We get to the next section of the Bible, which is the prophets, which is called Nevi'im. We sing Eliyahu ha-Navi. Navi means prophet. Nevi'im is prophets. Important general concept about prophets. The role of the prophet is to speak in the name of God. The prophet is a telephone, is a email, I don't know, whatever. I will never call a prophet a Twitter. Just if I do that, send me hate mail. Typically, the prophets come and they say, Ko Amar Adonai, thus saith the Lord. One of the reasons Jews don't accept Jesus as a prophet is because Jesus adds to the tradition and adds to what God says. So in the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, you hear a lot of others have told you this, this, and this, but I tell you, Jesus speaking in his own name, and he goes on and adds rules and understandings. So he gets eliminated as a prophet. The prophets typically emphasize, don't create new truths, but emphasize the old. And one of the things that gives credibility to these stories is how critical the prophets are of the Jews and the kings. The prophets typically are people that come and speak truth to power. And as you read some of the prophets, it is a long list of how the king and the Jews are screwing up and are going to pay dearly for having screwed up. And typically when nations write their own histories, they write glowing reports of how wonderful everything was. The fact that in our sacred history, the Bible, we are so self-critical, I think adds credibility to these texts and stories. So just briefly, kind of going down the list, Joshua continues the story in Deuteronomy. Some scholars believe it was originally part of the Torah. It talks about the conquest of Canaan. Judges, more history of the early days of the Israelites in the Holy Land, contains the folk tale Samson. If you go and read Samson, just read it. It's not very long at all. It is a hysterically funny story. I'll just stop there. I think I can't remember if I have it in this handout. Samuel 1 and 2, it was originally one book, the book of Samuel, but because it's so long, when they actually started printing it as books, they had to use two books. It talks about the kingship of Saul and David, the first kings of Israel. And then there's Book of Kings, which continues the story of Solomon and Solomon's sons, who are not very wise in their ruling. And because they are not very wise, the kingdom splits into two, into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. It continues to the destruction of the temple and the exile into Babylon. Isaiah, though it's one book, scholars believe that there are clearly three different voices, all called Isaiah, because they cover such a long period of time. So pre-exile, by exile here we mean the Babylonian exile. Second Isaiah during exile, and third Isaiah post-exilic. And we have this concept of a day in the future when the nations will beat their swords into plowshares, and the lion will lie down with the lamb, and everyone will come to worship at the house of the Lord, which is sort of the beginning of these messianic hopes for the future. Jeremiah, condemnation of the practices before exile that led to the exile. Ezekiel, kind of mystical vision of God's throne, vision of the dry bones. And then there's 12 minor prophets. The prophets aren't minor because of a lack of importance, but the books are very short. So one of those books is Jonah, and a very important quote from another book from Micah is saying that God teaches that we only need to do justly, to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Okay, the writings, the Ketuvim, These are the ones where they were incorporated into the canon in the year 90. There are Psalms, 150 Psalms. It's the longest book in the Bible. My understanding of this is Judaism does not treat this as the word of God. As I say at every funeral, I had a funeral yesterday. God, I'm getting confused. I have 4 funerals within 9 days this week. I don't know. Well, I do know what's going on, unfortunately. As I say at every funeral, God would not say, "The Lord is my shepherd," which is the 23rd Psalm. The Psalms are model prayers. There are Psalms for times of fear, for times of loneliness, for times of anger at God, for times of mourning. The 23rd Psalm being a prototypical psalm for a time of mourning. The book of Job is an amazing book on theodicy. The subject of theodicy is how do we reconcile the idea of a powerful, good, loving, just God with bad things happening to good people. And, for me, one of the amazing things about our canon is that we have an entire book set up to make us question that. And I also believe, I don't know if I wrote it here, the book of Job is really written to counteract the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy says it's very simple. If you're good, good things will happen to you. If you're bad, bad things will happen to you. It's nice, it's sweet, it's simple. The only problem is it's clearly wrong. The book of Job opens up the question, doesn't entirely answer it, but at least admits that it's more complicated. The Song of Songs, I mentioned erotic love poetry. The book of Ruth is a book about prototypical conversion. It takes someone, Ruth, who is specifically forbidden in the book of Deuteronomy from entering the household of Israel, and makes Ruth King David's great-grandmother. So it is a book written to counteract rules in Deuteronomy which speak against intermarriage. Here we have conversion, at least hints of conversion, and clearly marriage outside the tribe. Lamentations is an extended poem written after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, is a search for life's meaning. And the scholars, or the traditional scholars, the rabbis say, King Solomon, who was understood to be the wisest of kings, in his youth wrote the Song of Songs, which is erotic love poetry. In his maturity, and wrote the Proverbs, practical rules for living. And in his adulthood, even in his old age, wrote Ecclesiastes, which is a struggle with the meaning of life as approached by someone moving toward the end of their life. Oops. There we go. Okay, more in the writings. We have the book of Esther, which is the story of Purim, told without mentioning the name of God. Very interesting to study the book of Esther. Also, comic relief. You read the book of Esther, and it is a comedy. The book of Daniel, story of exile, speaks of apocalyptic times, distant future, end of days. Starts to introduce the idea of the immortality of the soul and resurrection of the dead. It's the only book in which angels have names, Michael and Gabriel. And about a third of the book is written in Aramaic. So the term Hebrew Bible isn't 100% correct. And then Ezra and Nehemiah tell the story of the return to Jerusalem once the Babylon has been conquered by Persia, and the Persians allow the Jews to return. And Chronicle is another history written with religious and moral focus. As I mentioned when we talked about Hanukkah, Hanukkah is not in the Bible. So that's your tour of the Bible. There's a lot of interesting stories. So, the copies of these slides are on my website. The story of David and Bathsheba, has the most beloved king of Israel committing murder and adultery, and covering it up, and yet somehow his reputation stands. So it's a fascinating book. books about Solomon's wisdom, messianic prophecy, the virgin birth. In Isaiah 7:14, the prophet, this is another important concept of prophets. Prophets would talk about the future, but their predictions for the future were always near term. Here's an example. If I come to you and I say, I am a prophet, and somebody says, oh yeah, prove it. I say, okay, 416 years from now, on October 14th, the sun will start spinning out rainbows. Now, do you believe me? No, because you're not going to be around 400 and something years from now. So in Jewish understanding, in Isaiah, Isaiah is approaching a king, and Isaiah is saying bad things are going to happen. And soon, how soon? He says, you see that young woman over there, that Alma? Before she gives birth, she's going to give birth, and the name of her child will be Emmanuel. And this is how soon it's going to happen. When the Bible is translated into Greek by Jews, they had to come up with they came up with the word for virgin, an unambiguous word in Greek meaning virgin, for the woman. In Hebrew, there is an unambiguous word for virgin. It is betulah, not alma. Alma is a young woman. And of course, we understand and expect that the young woman would be a virgin. But this is how the virgin birth enters Christianity, because the Christians, when they are quoting Old Testament, they're always quoting the Greek translation rather than going back to the Hebrew. Murray.
You mentioned earlier that the prophets you can think of as relayers of
Yes.
God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what you just said about a prophet saying, oh, something bad's going to happen to you,
Right.
Like soon. It reminded me in Joseph's story,
Right.
where he had dreams,
Right.
and they helped Pharaoh, and that helped him, in
Mhm.
reciprocation. Now, these dreams, were they from God? And would Joseph be considered a prophet?
Okay, so interestingly, Joseph is not considered a prophet, and I'm not sure why. Maybe just because we think of prophets as coming later. It's funny, Moses is really thought of as the first prophet. In Islam, Joseph is a prophet, and so is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Lot, and Noah. I think Noah. I'm not sure about Noah. So for some reason, Joseph is not traditionally called a Navi. But clearly, God speaks to Joseph in dreams. And also, the understanding is God guides Joseph understanding of dreams, because he interprets Pharaoh's dreams. It's a very good question. Isaiah, where we're called to be a light unto the nation. The book of Amos, often quoted that justice and righteousness shall roll down like a mighty stream. And God talks about how what God really wants is people to be just and righteous, and not so much sacrifice and fasting. And it's fascinating that we read these sections on Yom Kippur when we're fasting. I'm not going to get so much into the 23rd Psalm. I love the 90th Psalm that says to us, teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Wisdom, the beginning of wisdom, is the understanding that our lives are finite. We don't have forever to do the work we are sent here to do. And that's what gives urgency and meaning to our lives, once we understand that our lives are finite. And as I mentioned, the book of Job is a commentary or a discussion of this question of God and evil. Job's family is destroyed. His friends sit Shiva with him. The origin of Shiva is in Job. Job refuses to abandon his faith, but he demands that God show up as judge, witness, and jury in the trial of Job versus God, because Job is accusing God of being unjust. God finally responds in like 4 chapters. And basically, God is saying, I'm God, you're not. You can't possibly understand my ways. But your friends who have been quoting Deuteronomy saying you're suffering because you sinned, they're not correct. So the problem is more difficult. Scrolls we read on different holidays. I talked about some of these books. There's reading assignments for next time. Chapter 3, pages 14 to 29 in my book, and 537 to 540 in the next book. Next section is on Talmud. And so I want to just read a few sections of Bible and just point out some of the issues that we struggle with. I mentioned the grammatical error in the beginning. But the question is, was man and woman created at the same time, or was the woman created from a part of the man? So in the first chapter of Genesis, we read that God created man in God's own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. That's a pretty good translation. When we get to the second chapter, which we understand is written by a different author, the first chapter is P, second chapter is J. It says, then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. By the way, that's the reason why Jews understand that life begins at birth, when you breathe, rather than at conception. And the rib, which the Lord God had taken from the man, he made a woman and brought her unto the man. So we were actually discussing this a little bit today, some of us here, about, how do you reconcile these obvious inconsistencies? This is actually a very good place to point this out. So in chapter 1, male and female are created simultaneously. In Genesis chapter 2, the man is created first, and then the woman is created from some part of the man. It's clearly inconsistent. So how do we reconcile the inconsistencies? Remember my going on and on about which door you're in? So if you're in the world of being a literalist, if you take these, I'll call on you, Jose, in a second. If you take these texts literally, what the rabbis will say is, one possibility is that the first man, they call it Adam Rishon, which literally means the first Adam. Adam means human rather than a proper name, Adam. The first man was both male and female, a hermaphrodite. And one way that they image this is that it was like Siamese twins, but one twin was male, the other twin was female. And so that was what was created in Genesis 1. And then in Genesis 2, God did the surgery separating them. And there's several other stories which they would also use to explain it. If you're going to live behind door number 2, which is certainly where I live, which is in the community of people who study these texts as ancient legends and take them seriously but not literally, I understand that there were 2 different creation stories, and the editor couldn't bear to get rid of one. So he kept them both. Jose.
I think you already answered it, but I was gonna say that do we really need to reconcile the narratives? I mean, isn't it better just to read both of them and try to see what they're trying to tell us each, instead of trying to make a third one that?
Yeah. So you're stating it actually better than I did, which is what the rabbis are doing is they are trying to read both stories in a way that we learn from them. First of all, they can't help themselves from reconciling them, because otherwise it would appear as though God made an error and there's an inconsistency in the text. So they would say there's no inconsistency in the text, and really there's something deeper going on. And then we could talk about, if we were going to study this text, what's the deeper message? I can't go there because we'd spend the rest of the time talking about it. There are some strange things just before the flood story and just before the time of Noah. It came to pass when men began to multiply in the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God, B'nai Elohim. So, okay, I'll go back there in a second. Saw the daughters of men that they were fair and took them wives, whomsoever they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is also flesh. Therefore his days shall be 120 years. Before this people were living 600 and 700 years. And the Nephilim were in the earth in those days. And also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children of them, the same were mighty men, were of old, and men of renown. And I don't remember the traditional explanation for this, but from a scholarly point of view, I would say this was just a sacred legend that the editor of the text couldn't bear to get rid of. And what do they mean by the sons of God? Well, the word for God is Elohim, and Elohim can refer not only to God, but to judges. Let's see, as a scientist, how do you figure these? Okay, so that's an important question David's asking. As a scientist, how do I figure these stories? Oh, no, okay, it was Deborah's asking about creation of men and women. So I will say this again, over and over again, another thing you can send hate mail to me when I say it too many times. I take these stories seriously, but not literally. One important element I don't think I have in any of these charts is the question, at what point in time do we find archaeological evidence for what we read in the Bible? And the first clear mention of a figure in the Bible in material that's outside the Bible is King David. And then there are lots of references that seem to be coming from about the time of King David. So Adam and Eve, I don't believe for a second that this is a true story. I think it's teaching things. And again, if we study that text carefully, I think we can learn lessons from the story of Adam and Eve. But I don't take for a minute the story literally. I don't believe that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob refer to actual historical characters, nor do I believe Moses and Pharaoh refer to actual historical characters. These are our sacred legends. Let me state what one of my colleagues stated and got into a lot of trouble. David Wolpe, who is the rabbi of a very large conservative synagogue, got into a huge amount of trouble when around Passover he made a simple, true statement. His simple, true statement was there is no archaeological evidence for anything relating to the Exodus. And if we take the story literally, there were about 2 million Israelites in the desert for 40 years. They would have left some archaeological record of their existence, and there is none. People jumped on him saying, you don't believe in the Exodus, you don't believe in Judaism. He never said that. He just stated something that is true. Give me 1 second. Okay. This is another, I think, important thing. Jose, you have another question. Your hand's up.
Yeah. So you just said that you don't believe that there was a Moses, So
but I think the stories of Moses are incredibly important, but they're not necessarily accurate historical records.
Yeah. So how would you reconcile that with the idea of the revelation of Sinai?
So I believe something happened at Sinai, and the Torah is our record of what happened at Sinai. Do I believe that record is necessarily historical? The answer is there's no evidence for anything in that story outside of what we read in the Bible. That's my scholarly hat, but I live behind both doors. I also love to live in a world that takes the story literally and searches deeply for hidden meanings and truths and lessons to learn. One of the things, I'm sure I said this before, is I understand Torah like I understand the story of the boy who cried wolf, which is to say, the boy that cried wolf, the significance of that story is in the lesson it teaches, not did the story ever actually happen.
One last question. Have you read the book The Exodus by Frank Finkelstein or something like that?
I don't think so.
No, okay. You should. I'd like to get your thoughts
Okay.
on it, please.
Okay. One question, can God see the future? Again, just before the flood, it says, and the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him at his heart. So this is filled with theological questions. How can God regret that he had done anything? That, forgive me for calling God a he. How can God regret that God had done anything? And what does it mean that God's heart was saddened or grieved? And I can tell you there's some really fascinating modern insights in that question. Let me move on. You know, generally speaking, we think of Moses going to Pharaoh as a, you know, a suspense story. Well, here's plague number 1. Is Pharaoh going to give in? Here's plague number 2. Is Pharaoh going to give in? What's the matter with Pharaoh? What's wrong with this guy? He keeps changing his mind. At the beginning of the story, God tells Moses, long before Moses actually goes to Pharaoh, God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not hearken to you, and I will lay my hand upon Egypt, bringing forth my armies, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch forth my hand against Egypt and bring out the children of Egypt among them. Is that fair? Was it fair that God punished the Egyptians when God, in effect, strengthened Pharaoh to not yield? So there's lots of discussion about that. And really, one of the explanations, which I can't, resist at least mentioning, is the idea that what's really going on in this story of the plagues is the battle of God versus the gods of Egypt. Every plague is actually directed against the god of Egypt. And what's going on here is a very powerful statement that God is the most powerful of all of the other gods. And God could just simply make that statement, but it's not as powerful as when we repeat the story every year at Seder and take a little drop of wine out of our cups at the Seder, and you have Charlton Heston and the 10 Commandments and all of these great images. It's a story nobody forgets. Boy, there's just a lot going on here. I think I mentioned 3 times in the Bible, God specifies that if somebody knocks out your eye, you should knock out their eye. The rabbis of the Talmud prove that God didn't mean it. And this is also the way of reforming Judaism. I can hear Murray wondering, who are these guys that have the chutzpah to say that God did not mean what's written 3 times, but they do. And they prove it using good logic, using good Greek logic, that God couldn't have possibly meant an eye for an eye. Let's see, Suzanne is asking, yes, we do, and many of them are terrifying. I think this is really problematic. Okay, we teach these stories to our kids as if they're true. Yeah, I think teaching them as if they're true is problematic, which is why most Bible stories are simple and wonderful and pleasant and beautiful, and don't get into these difficulties. And I think, you should teach it in an age-appropriate manner. And there's a lot that I still find very troubling. And, I've worked out my own theology on how to deal with these problem texts. There's plenty of books written on this subject of how we deal with problematic texts. I'm not going to read the story, but just to show you that it's there in the book of Judges, there is a general Jephthah, who basically makes a promise to God that if you're with me in this battle that I'm about to go into, when I get home, I will sacrifice the first thing that I see when I reach my home. And sure enough, it's his daughter. And he goes ahead and does it. With her willingness. So, the idea Jews don't sacrifice people. Well, here's another troubling text. I am sure that you never read it. There's a book called Jephthah's Daughter. So there's all kinds of troubling texts. Yeah, I talked about the women. Okay, my last item here is next Tuesday. So today's Wednesday. Not quite a week from tonight, I will actually be moderating a discussion between Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, a columnist for New York Post, a contributing writer for National Review, as well as a regular columnist for Haaretz and other magazines, and J.J. Goldberg, editor emeritus at The Forward, bureau chief for the Jerusalem Report, U.S. bureau chief, managing editor, New York Jewish Week, as they discuss the left versus right perspectives on Judaism and Israel, specifically the battle of the soul for American Jewry. Question, has President Trump's policies been good for Israel? Would Biden be better or worse? Should Jews ally themselves with the Black Lives Matter movement? Should American Jews take a stand on the battle for control of the Supreme Court? And where does the real danger come? Danger from anti-Semitism come, left or the right? So a lot of interesting things going on there. And I've hosted panels with these two gentlemen in the past. I will send out an email with the link that that can allow you to come into this program. It's actually, I think it's the Jewish Federation in San Diego, in Ventura County and in Santa Barbara County are all participating in this. Okay, I'm going to stop the sharing, and we do have a few minutes. If you're not exhausted, I'm sort of exhausted, for questions or comments. I know I fly through a lot of this, and I do want to mention that for those of you studying for conversion, we are having a session tomorrow night at 7, and which, questions that you might not feel appropriate to interject during this class, you certainly can. And we're talking, because sometimes I will use words like mitzvah, and in that book, the Handbook for Judaism, maybe it's not just the non-Jews that have trouble with it, but somebody said to me, I don't understand the table of contents. And so my question was, what do you mean? And so we opened the table of contents, and I think the first item was various berachot. So what part about various berachot don't you understand, having never seen the word baracha or heard the concept of a baracha before? So there's a lot going on. So I want to have a separate time for those of you who are not Jewish, and I won't just say not everybody is convinced they want to convert, but for those of you who are not Jewish, I want to have a separate time which is much less structured. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation at which you can raise questions. And as I say to both the people studying for conversion and anyone else, if you want to just have a separate time to talk, I will be honored and happy to set up such a time with you. And if you're interested in conversion and interested in me being your sponsoring rabbi, that is a necessity. Okay, any questions, comments, or thoughts?
Yeah.
Yes, Carson.
So I know the Christian Bible, there are a lot of different translations, more than the ones that you covered here.
Well, I didn't cover necessarily translations.
Oh, okay.
Just which books are in which Bible. But
right.
Yeah, there are scores of different translations.
Is it the same with the Jewish Bible, or are there as many, or is there?
Well, probably not as many, because, there are 2 billion Christians in the world, and we only have 15 million Jews. but I would say in Judaism, there is much more of a focus, an implicit understanding that we should go back to the Hebrew. And there's also an implicit understanding that we should rely on scholars, and specifically the rabbis of the Talmudic era. There is this concept, it's almost a mystical concept in Judaism, that the closer you are to Sinai chronologically, the more inspired you are. It's almost like we're getting away from a magical event. And so therefore, our opinions, the opinions of me and my friends, are not nearly as authoritative as the rabbis 1,500 years ago. But ultimately, and I know I said this in the early sessions, Judaism is a tradition which interprets the Hebrew Bible through the interpretive lens of the rabbis and the Talmud. Christianity is a tradition which interprets the Hebrew Bible through the interpretive lens of the New Testament and the Church Fathers. The Protestants, protesting the abuses of the Catholic Church, rejected this concept of I need priests and scholars and monks to tell me what the Bible means, and they adopted a position which I think is generally called sola scriptura, which means just give me the Bible, I'll interpret it for myself. But that raises the question, which language do you want to have the Bible in? I would say at least study it in Hebrew and Greek, if for no other reason than to be aware of some of these problems. Once you start translating it into other languages, the translator wants to get rid of some of these awkward problems. And in fact, even in Jewish translations, you have some translators whose goal is to capture the feeling of the Hebrew text, even in its awkward grammatical structure and statements. I would say it's more common that Jewish translations try to make the text make sense in common American English. So, for example, in this book, they have two English translations of every bit of text. One is the old JPS, which was written in 1916, and the other is the new JPS, which is written in the 1960s or 70s. The new JPS sounds much more readable. The old JPS is actually a lot closer to King James version, and it's actually more literal. It's actually a truer translation. But yeah, if you go to Torah study, we sit around and we read the text, and then there's always questions about what does the Hebrew say, and how does that influence our understanding? And this particular book is really good at that particular issue. Gotcha. This book will go out of its way to focus on what is the Hebrew and how does the translation compare with what the Hebrew is saying.
Except Hebrew wasn't a spoken language for hundreds or thousands of years, and when they reintroduced it in Peter Herzl's time, it was relying on the translations to know what the words mean. So so people that didn't translate things accurately, our modern Hebrew would have the same errors built into it.
Okay, let me just correct some of the timeline. Okay. Hebrew was a common spoken language 3,000 years ago, approximately. And the understanding is sometime around 2,000 years ago, it was no longer a common spoken language. But it was always the language of prayer and the language of commentaries. So knowledgeable Jews understood Hebrew. I would say literate Jews understood Hebrew, particularly the Hebrew of the Bible and the commentaries. You are absolutely right that it fell into disuse and was revived around the time of Herzl, but it was revived by Eliezer ben Yehuda slightly before Herzl's time. And one of the interesting things about Eliezer ben Yehuda in his obsession to revive Hebrew, he went back to biblical Hebrew. Because just like English has gone through, you know, you have Shakespearean and Chaucerian and Anglo and Saxon. And I mean, I'm not anything like an expert on the English language. So too, when I learned Hebrew, I learned Aramaic. I learned Rabbinic Hebrew, which is Hebrew heavily influenced by Aramaic. And then there's, so that's medieval Hebrew, and that's the language of the commentators. And so when Ben Yehuda decided to revive Hebrew, he deliberately went back to biblical Hebrew. Now he had, one of the challenges was to make up lots of words because there was no word for banana. You know what the Hebrew word for banana is? Banana. Okay, perfectly good word for banana. And they used kind of fanciful words that nobody quite knows what they mean. So Ezekiel has this image of fire from heaven. If you read the book of Ezekiel, and the word is chashmal. So Ben Yehuda said that's the word we're going to use for electricity. Yes, Deborah.
When I was growing up and up till a few years ago, this religion was called Judaism. Now it's Judaism. What is going on? When did that all switch up?
I think it depends on whether you're from New York.
I'm from New Jersey.
From Jersey, from Boston. I just think it's a different.
I grew up in a different temple. It wasn't Judaism there either. That was California.
Yeah, I am not aware that that's anything other than a regional dialectical difference.
No kidding. And Adonai is another one.
That's another question.
Mhm.
So Hebrew, broadly speaking, has two major pronunciation traditions, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic.
Yeah.
And that's very much like Boston and New York, okay? So in the Ashkenazi, which is Eastern European, the word for the Sabbath is Shabbos. In the Sephardic, which is from Jews of Muslim lands, I'm way oversimplifying, the word for the Sabbath is Shabbat. The word for the prayer shawl, Ashkenazi, talis, Sephardic, talit. The word for my Lord, Ashkenazi, Adonai, Sephardic, Adonai. Umain, Amen. Yiskadal v'yiskadash Shemei Rabbah. Yitgadal v'yitgadash Shemei Rabbah. Forgive me, people who don't know what these prayers, but Jews will know the prayers really well. When I went to Hebrew school, this was shortly after the time of Moses, we were taught the Ashkenazi way of pronouncing Hebrew. My understanding is that in the late 60s, particularly after the 67 war, as a way of aligning Judaism with Israel, that both the Reform movement and the conservative movement started pronouncing Hebrew the way it's pronounced in Israel, which is the Sephardic way of pronouncing it.
That makes sense to me. Thank you.
You're welcome. Happy I could clear that one up. That was easy.
Yeah.
When I was teaching kind of kindergarten age kids about religions, I asked them, name a few religions. So somebody said Judaism, and somebody said, Christianity and Mormon, and one kid said Buddhism, which I like that actually. Okay, any other questions, comments? Okay, so I'll see you when I see you. Happy Sukkot. We're in the middle of Sukkot. And, I actually had let me show this. Let me see if I can show this. I got to find it first. Hold on. I got to find it on my web page. Whoa. Okay, there it is. Okay, let's see if I can do this. Oh, damn it. I always click the wrong icon. Okay. Oops. Full screen. Okay, so I am going to Actually, I'm going to stop the recording.